Welcome to the Edu Trends Podcast and Webcast brought to you by the Institute for the Future of Education of Tecnológico de Monterrey. I'm José Pepe Escamilla, IFE Associate Director. Today's episode guest is Roberta Bassett, Global Lead for Tertiary Education and Senior Education Specialist at the World Bank. It's a pleasure to have you here, Roberta.
Thank you, Pepe. It's really my pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I look forward to our conversation.
Great. First of all, I would like to ask you to tell us about your work at the World Bank.
Sure, I'm happy to. So I have two streams of work in my dual roles at the World Bank. I am the global lead for tertiary education, and along with Nina Arnold, we sort of coordinate the global portfolio of the World Bank's work in tertiary education. And that includes supporting all those that are working in higher education around the world on their technical needs, advising, providing peer review, things like that. But it's also monitoring the portfolio so that we have a clear information base to share with the world in conversations like this one about the scope and the concepts and the impact of the World Bank's work in tertiary education around the world. And then we also, as a global lead, I do a lot of analytical work to also provide the intellectual sort of data-driven, evidence-based information that's needed for us to have our projects be fully informed by what is known in the world of research, what academics are doing, but also what the data is telling us. So that's one stream of my work, but I also lead projects. I'm also a member of the Africa education team in particular. So I lead projects in East and Southern Africa, including the African Centers of Excellence initiative in East and Southern Africa and several bilateral projects. So I have two streams of work, some that is sort of umbrella global work and some that actually keeps me grounded in the field so that I'm still deeply involved in operational work of the bank as well.
Thank you, Roberta. So I understand that part of your work is around financial sustainability. So I will ask you what we have learned about higher education institutions in developing countries, how they can achieve financial sustainability.
Yes, I think this is, if not the most important question facing our institutions, it's one of the most important. I mean, we talk about some of the big three issues that institutions manage on a regular basis. One is effective governance. Two is, the importance of recognizing quality, internal institutional quality, as well as system level quality assurance. And then the third is effective financing. And so I think, then we have all of the additional issues, equity, right? Climate recognition and climate attention and things like this. But for the management of an institution, financing is definitely one of the core concerns. And financial sustainability isn't just a challenge for developing country institutions, it's a challenge for institutions around the world. And so there are lessons that can be learned, right, from what has happened at institutions that maybe have a little bit longer histories of financial diversification, right, where there is more financial streams coming into the institution than tuition or government expenditures. That's one of the ways that we support our clients in looking at what their options are. What else is out there? What has been tried in their country context? What kind of options do they have? I think that the big conversation right now is twofold. One is working with governments to make their spending more efficient and more relevant to government spending, and having institutions be both more autonomous in how they can spend that money, but more accountable as well. So that balance between accountability and autonomy is a conversation that's happening more and more globally. But also this question of how much private funding is coming into the institutions, both in terms of the private family level spending, but also public-private partnerships, how much can be utilized from the private sector in terms of contracting, either that's courses being paid for, provided by private providers onto the public campuses, or down to things like who owns the youth hostels and the dormitories, who does the landscaping, who does, some of that can be privatized, so the costs are removed from different coffers, right? And so that's sort of looking at what are the options for making spending more efficient. I think that's maybe the more challenging part. In many parts of the world, private is very difficult to sort of bring into public higher education in any form of private. In some places, it's private spending, it's meant to be free. It's constitutionally free. And so how do you then, right, create institutions that still are quite solvent in an environment where the pressures through massification and other sort of forms of expanded delivery still have a very restricted financial base? Some things can be done in terms of using the campus more efficiently. I used to run summer session at Stanford University, and summer session at Stanford was a time that was about revenue generation and really doing things that were entrepreneurial and innovative to create some extra revenues for the institution. There's a lot of that, conferences and elements of the institution that can be almost exported to a larger market besides the natural traditional market of the institution. So it is about some entrepreneurial thinking. We do talk a lot, we at the bank, but I think the global community of higher education speaks a lot about innovation and intellectual property, and some of the great examples like Stanford that have made billions of dollars on patents and things like this. But this is not something that we could say every institution is going to achieve, should aspire to achieve. It's not part of their mission, and it certainly isn't part of a normal operating budget environment. So it is a blue sky thing, and maybe some schools will get lucky, but I think that's something that we know, we recognize, people care about, but isn't something that we actually talk a lot about as having a realistic impact on financial sustainability at the institutional level. That's a very tour of the field sort of answer to your question. I don't know if you want to narrow it down into some more specific issues, but that's the broadest interpretation of the question, I think.
Yeah, great. I think there's a lot to unpack on what you said, but I was thinking about this entrepreneurial thinking that we need in universities, and there's like I don't know how to say that, an impedance mismatch with what the university is, that normally it's created to maintain the status quo. And entrepreneurship, it's about changing, pivoting, taking opportunities that are there. So I was wondering if you have some ideas or advice or learnings of how can a university that is a traditional university run traditionally introduce this entrepreneurial thinking to achieve a better financial sustainability in all these aspects that you just said?
Well, a lot of it depends on the culture, right? What is the culture? I was in Finland a few years ago, and the Finnish institutions, which are traditional in their sort of histories, are very non-traditional in sort of their relationship with their students and the relationships of their students and their faculty to this external world, this external sort of marketplace of ideas and information. And so one of the big takeaways from that was the amount of energy and support and strength that's given to students to be entrepreneurial, to be sort of innovative and creative and sort of thinking outside the box as they learn, but also as they do extracurriculars, creates an environment actually that sort of ripples across. It allows the institution to think more entrepreneurially, allows academic staff to think more entrepreneurially as well. It gives room for this type of ideas to breathe, which I think is really important. I think you're right. There are institutions around the world, and I think Latin America, which, where you are based, but also which has maybe the deepest sort of history around these questions of the relationship of the institution to society. And, there's such a wonderful, deep, rich history that's quite challenging in that context. So in your context, in the context, I have very good friends who teach across, Brazil and Mexico and Colombia. The dialogue is so different because it is about still demanding from the government what the government is meant to provide, but also living sort of in this global knowledge economy that is where your students are going to go, right? And how you balance off that relationship between making sure that expectations are met where they are meant to be met, but also innovating still and not losing pieces of either because of that balance being so challenging in that space. In other places in the US, and I talked about Stanford, but it's because it's an institution I know so well. It's very normal, this idea that the institutions exist in a marketplace amongst each other, but also for their labor of the graduates, for the ideas of their faculty. That whole ecosystem around innovation is so normal now. It has been for maybe 50 years or so. So, some of it is just about catching up. Some of it is learning to see, what your ecosystem supports right now, and maybe how it can be made to be more dynamic through dialogue with leaders of the banking system, the taxation system, the labor market, all of those elements, right? Not every country has venture capital or all of these really important fiscal drivers for innovation, but they can still be part of conversation. And we're doing a lot of that in Africa, where we do foster relationships between innovation hubs in Scandinavia, in Europe, and US, Canada, to support changing that ecosystem in the countries where we work, because it's an iterative process. It takes a while. But the thinking does start with youth. It starts with students. It starts with, changing the way students relate to their faculty, to their ideas of what they can do when they finish their degrees, etc.
Thank you for the answer. So culture is very important, and one of the means to start that culture is embracing the entrepreneurship programs for students that could have some repercussions in the culture of the university eventually. And I agree with you that in Latin America, public universities has this more government-based sustainability model than in other parts of the world. But I think that financing is being more and more scarce, and there are more things pressuring the governments to invest in retirement, health, and other areas, not only in education. So I believe that these questions are important for everyone, not only for private universities now in Latin America, but also for public universities.
Absolutely. Maybe more important for public institutions. And it is the question, we talked about this a bit before, but one of the things the World Bank is talking about a lot is institutional diversification, in systems that have relied and very consistently invested most heavily in research universities. There are lower cost, high quality ways to deliver mass higher education that isn't at a research university. I know you know that very well, but I think that part of that conversation about efficient spending, effective spending, relevant spending is about, well, what else can be done to deliver high quality education, not to affect the quality of the education at all, but to the larger expanding body of students. It can't happen with the same replication of expensive research university environments. There isn't the financing for it. It doesn't exist, but there are models, and they exist, especially in the US, but in other places as well, that do give examples of ways to deliver to more students at high quality for lower cost. And I think that's something more countries will need to be looking into in the future.
Thank you, Roberta. So during the COVID crisis, I don't know if we're still in the COVID crisis, but it has lessened during the last months. We have seen a lot of investment in technology, particularly in educational technology for learning, teaching, learning. So why could it be important or not to invest in technology services, learning in universities?
I think this was a massive question that emerged during COVID, because, and maybe you're familiar with this, your audience may be as well. Prior to COVID, we actually were trying to pull back a little from the conversation about this massive investment in technology, because it was taking funds away from more bread and butter issues that we thought maybe still needed more focus, a stronger focus on institution-based quality, improving teaching, right? Things that seemed sort of separate from technology, which nothing is separate from technology anymore. And so that's the big shift that COVID wrought, which is to say, no matter what you thought was going to be the focus, technology is part of all of that now. And I think that's in the short term, that has had, the digital divide has maybe been something spoken about more than enough in this period, but there has been some expanded inequities that have been driven by technological innovations that were affordable and available in certain places that weren't in others, that were available for certain people and weren't for other people. And it's most important today, and in this immediate sort of not quite post, but almost post-COVID crisis, that research get done, that every country, every institution know who was lost, who was supported best, what were the impacts, because that's where the interventions are going to have to happen. They're going to have to happen in a way that closes that gap. And so that will be first order. I think the first order is going to be who got lost at the institution level from this investment and focus on technology. And then the next is going to be, what are the most efficient ways to spend on what can give the most immediate returns, which I think would be teaching at this point. I think it would be about, how do you deliver in a resilient system, right? That one that will be able to withstand shocks in the future. They may not be pandemic related, but they certainly could be environmental or, civil wars, any kind of disruptions. You see all sorts of forms of disruption, and now institutions should be more equipped to manage those through technology. But what was missing and filling those gaps, and then where can it be most readily applied in the short term, and then medium and long term. Medium long term, I think we're looking at something more along the lines of this massive amount of blended learning, this massive amount of improved research capacity through technology, collaborations, cross-border collaborations through major research initiatives, things that research universities do incredibly well. Technology will foster so much of that. I also think that post-secondary technical education, technical vocational education that happens in the post-secondary period of learning really needs to look at how technology can be used to bridge disruptions, because we saw all of these technical fields that are very hands-on had the hardest time managing the disruptions of the pandemic. That also includes medical and dental, veterinary sciences, all of these things where the training is very hands-on and requires sort of lab spaces, and technology can be used, but it's really expensive. It's very infrastructure intensive. And so that's more of a long-term investment. I think that's going to be happening, in the next sort of 10 to 20 years. The cross-border delivery of courses, I think, is something that's going to stay and get bigger. Partnerships with providers of major MOOC type courses, but ones that can be, I think, more bespoke to the institution's needs. There was a lot of absorption of what was the market offering and can we get it for free, and things that completely made sense at the time, but it also put institutions on the back foot, I think, in being able to drive what they needed, drive that negotiation to make sure that what they got was appropriate for their institution, their students, their course and their curriculum. That's going to be the correction that will happen now. Institutions need to be a little bit more forward leaning into that relationship with those external providers of courses, take what they need, make sure that they get a good deal for that, make sure it's right for their students and their staff and their programs that they deliver, and make sure that the quality assurance environment allows for those types of programs to be accredited in a way that their degrees have validity on the ground. I think that's something that was really missing as well. There's a lot of conversations happening now with all of these courses that actually hadn't been vetted within the quality assurance environment at the institutional or systems level, and that retroactively has to happen, or it has to happen immediately to allow for these things to have sustained value. Again, long answer, I'm sorry. I love these conversations though, so. Yeah.
A great answer. So I agree with you that in the short term, teaching, learning, enhancing teaching, learning with technology, it's a great idea. I think it's a way to have some wins for the organization, giving more flexibility to students that are around the university, because if you do online for students that are not around the university, you need to also have other services to offer to them online. That is not only the teaching learning part, it's all of the other services of the university. Equally for blended learning. Blended learning for students that are around the university is relatively easy, but if you do that for students that are far away, that have to commute for a lot of kilometers or miles, it's going to be more difficult. So I agree with you, but there's the other side of the investment of the coin is, if we're talking about investing in universities on this, but about the access of students, because also what the pandemic reminds us is the lack of access to internet, to an equipment for the students. So there's also a problem to solve there.
I completely agree. And I think that's where the first order idea that I have for this period and this question is, institutions really have to take stock of what happened. And I think there is still a slow uptake in that, and really sort of assessing things, not just sort of reacting, constantly reacting. We're still, I think, in a lot of the world, still reacting, cleaning up the mess, trying to get things back to normal. Everything is really moving towards back to normal. But who was lost, and in that process, how do we not lose them again? How do we make sure we get them back? I think there was a lot of creativity. We talked about internally, where we saw really interesting things happening, where they would use high schools or they would use elementary schools that were wired in because homes weren't wired in certain parts of our client countries around the world. It was very well known, right? What other ways, what other means for delivery besides an immediate, simple, what we're doing right now, which is so easy for us because we have the infrastructure. But for many, many students, as soon as they left their cities, not just their campus, maybe an urban environment, but left the urban environment, in countries with internet penetration of 30, 40, 50%, half the country doesn't have internet. It's impossible. What else could be done? In some places it was negotiating with mobile carriers to allow for low cost or free delivery through mobile provision. In other places it was buses with mobile networks driving into towns and saying you have 4 hours to do a big data dump from your institution, and every student shows up and does that. Whatever that the answer was, that's where the research has to happen. We really want to know those stories and what worked and what kind of creativity was involved, because that will give us, all of us, you, me, all of us who study these issues for a living and hope to create effective policy around what we learn, the evidence that we need for a litany, a menu of options that can exist for institutions to intervene today, tomorrow, and then thinking about, when you have perfect infrastructure, what could you then do with a sort of a more global mobile delivery of higher education. But really it's about doing that in a nicely stepped order that allows for it to be informed and thoughtful and reasonable to the environment where this is taking place, because it's different everywhere.
So looking for being an entrepreneur in that area also, and looking at ways of reaching the students and giving access to them, partnering with different people, government, private sector. Mm-hmm. So there's no clear answer there. We need to do more research to find what are the different models that could be implemented more massively. Is my understanding? Mm-hmm.
Yes, I say this a lot, but I think the smartest people you'll find in any environment really are people at institutions, at universities, at colleges. They are just so smart and creative. I think there's a external wish to see them as sort of these monolithic, unmoving, conservative places, but so much of what is driving the global innovations in every field is emerging from institutions, universities, right? So allowing them, and I think COVID did give this moment for creative responses to a huge challenge. Universities led that challenge extremely well around the world. It wasn't necessarily universally amazing, but every place was trying really hard, and many institutions did an extremely good job. And so for us who want to then take those stories and apply them to sort of larger lessons that the global space can learn from, that's where we need each institutions to tell us their stories and do the research that they're so great at doing, but do it on themselves, on that experience. And some will want to do that and others won't, but it will benefit all of us the more we get from that experience.
Thank you, Roberta. So I want to change now the subject to lifelong learning. I believe that lifelong learning will become as important as or more as higher education in the future. So people will have to train themselves to have better job opportunities and retrain themselves more frequently. And in universities, we have a continuous education area that is like most of the time regarded inside the universities as a second-class thing inside, mm-hmm. compared to 4-degree education. So I wanted to ask you, what do you think about lifelong learning opportunities developed by universities in the future, and what universities can offer compared to private providers like the Coursera's, boot camps, mm-hmm. Local startups or businesses that offer these kind of opportunities that are not necessarily 4-degree?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, first, I completely agree with you. I think lifelong learning is not just something that is going to be required, but it's something we should aspire. We should aspire to as societies around the world, to give every person an opportunity to find their learning path, and that learning path is for their entire lives. I think that's an ambitious and important goal that every country should have, because we're seeing the repercussions, I think, of some of the challenges around the changing information landscape, right? And people's ability to have critical assessments of the information that's coming at them, and how to make sense of all of the social media information sources. All of these things actually can be improved by just moments of learning how information is fed, learning how they process information, right? So every human benefits from these opportunities to go back and just take some time and learn something different, take themselves out of their day-to-day life and invest in something else. So most of that will be around skills and jobs. And I think that's an important environment for all of us who work in education to be talking about. Skills and jobs is one of those things institutions, I think, don't like talking about. I have met many countries where university leaders especially are resistant to conversations around responsibilities for training skilled graduates. And I often ask them just to flip that conversation and talk about the fact that they are skilling their graduates, right? They are, we know that they are. They can put the narrative much more front and center and say, we're skilling you through these media, which is English literature or political science or whatever it is, instead of saying, I'm going to make you politically science aware. But when you're doing that, you'll get these skills down here. You can flip the narrative and still talk about skills first, because then everyone understands what's the point of the education. And I think that is something that they can do for lifelong learning as well. We can provide you these skills. You're 40, you're 50, you're 70, whatever it is. These are the skills that this learning environment provides, and it's going to be relevant for you as you go about your, Jamil Salmi has a presentation and he's been talking about it for a long time, but there's a lot of data saying that adults will have 3, 4, 5 discrete career paths in the course of their adult lives. And that's not progression through a singular career field. It's like 5 distinct fields of work, right? And so that requires reskilling at each point so that you can be the best that you can be in that chosen profession of yours at that time. In many parts of the world, like Eastern Europe is a great example, where their population declines are heavily impacting the sustainability of their higher education sectors. Lifelong learning is actually an opportunity to accomplish a couple of goals. It allows the universities to have more stability in what they offer. They can still offer traditional, but also continue operating while they have an incoming class of students from a lifelong learning pool instead of just a traditional pool. And it allows, when there's a diminished number of workers, it allows those who've left the workforce to come back in, reskill, and enter the workforce as well, especially women who left perhaps to marry and have children, or who just were living at a time where when they were traditionally aged, women didn't go to school, for instance, right? So there's all these abilities to also affect social change through lifelong learning that is really important for countries around the world. And I think that's something universities can lead the conversation around, lead the curricular development around, and facilitate relationships with the labor market. They are hugely respected institutions. Universities have convening power and respectability that labor market leaders do respect and do like. And this relationship can be built around, we will work with you to build the curriculum that can help your workers, that can help sort of your field of study, which is good for everybody. It's great for the whole environment, but it's really important that institutions see themselves again as part of that ecosystem and not sort of as a silo of, elite learning, which they still can be, obviously, but they exist in society as social instruments and social actors, and that role is really important. And lifelong learning really provides for that as well, provides for that expanded role in society. And then your point, I think, which is a really important one around continuing studies or general studies being seen as sort of second-class degrees, but that's something institutions have a lot of power around. Who teaches the courses? When are the courses offered? Who gets to sit in those courses? If they're relegated to terrible times of day and they're all adjunct faculty, then that's not an incorrect perception, is it? I mean, it means the institutions themselves are demeaning that course, right? Institutions like Columbia University, which has a School of General Studies, which has the same faculty that teach the Columbia College students. I went to Columbia, so my undergraduate, it was all the same faculty taught those courses. The degree comes out, it has the same respectability in the environment around it. So it really is about the institution owning that, owning continuing studies, owning the lifelong learning delivery environment, and respecting it as much as they respect their traditional educational undergraduate arms or their graduate school arms.
Yes. Thank you for your answer, Roberta. I agree with you that my perception that at least in Latin America, there's this discussion if universities develop good citizens, people that are started in the society, or they train for work. I'm talking about 4-degree education.
Sure.
And I think that they should do both. No, it's not.
Yeah, why can't it be both? Yeah, exactly.
It has to be both. And if we agree about that, having an area of lifelong learning that is very solid and connected with the industry, business, government, and society will be very good, because it's a way of connecting faculty also to the real needs, the needs of the real world, and developing this curriculum also. Not only for lifelong learning, but for degree education connected with the needs of the society. So that I think could be a good option. So I believe that we agree on that.
I think too, universities are often challenged by being so defensive about their value to society, right? They're often asked to defend their position, to defend how expensive they are, to defend whatever. And I think institutions, universities especially, can just do a better job at their messaging and saying how fundamentally important they are as social instruments and social development agents for their societies and their cultures. They can do better. And this is one of the streams, lifelong learning is one of the streams where they could actually illustrate that as well. I'm sorry, I interrupted something.
No problem. So universities need to construct a better narrative of the...
Yeah, I think so. I really do.
It's a very important thought. Yeah. Well, thank you, Roberta, for your time and for sharing with us some strategies and actions for universities around these issues of financing, technology, and lifelong learning. This talk has been fascinating and enjoyable for me. I enjoyed talking to you. I believe that we were having a coffee somewhere while we were talking, and it will surely be of great value to the Institute for the Future of Education's audience. That's what I believe.
Thank you, Pepe. I loved it. I had a great time. And yes, I think I forgot that I was speaking for an academic environment. So I hope it was what you needed. And I look forward to talking to you again in the future.
Thank you. We're looking forward to talking to you again. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much. Bye.